Africa is a continent that has been a chamber of horrors for decades. It's really not the fault of the African people. It's largely a result of the kind of system that's been perpetuated there. You have these oligarchs which dominate these countries that oftentimes have natural resources that can be very lucrative. And these oligarchs strike deals with foreign corporations or foreign governments who in effect prop them up and put them in power. And in exchange, these oligarchs give these entities access to rich mineral deposits. And the Clintons, you would expect to be opposed to this sort of thing, and that's at least what their language does.
Our countries have deepened our cooperation on many issues, including good governance and transparency, energy, regional security, and advancing peace and development in the Niger Delta.
The problem is, their words are different from their actions.
Rwanda has clearly taken an impressive trajectory of development, and the people here still think Kagame is the man to take them to another level.
President Paul Kagame has walked all around the crowd, thanking the people for electing him unopposed as chairman of the RPF or president of the RPF for another 7-year term.
But his critics say that far from entrenching democracy in Rwanda, he's actually eroding it by silencing his opposition.
Paul Kagame has been praised by Bill Clinton and the Clinton Foundation. But the fact of the matter is Paul Kagame has a terrible human rights record. He's accused of aiding military operations in the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo, and that actually forced the recruitment of child soldiers. The UN has identified him as being involved in activities that entailed massive human rights violations.
The newer opposition parties that have been formed in the last year or two have one by one been silenced or otherwise excluded from the race. And individuals, so not only politicians, but even journalists, for example, and other Rwandans who may have views different from those of the government, have found themselves at the receiving end of what has become quite a violent campaign of intimidation.
Well, Paul Kagame is a friend of Bill Clinton's.
I want to say a special word of appreciation for the leadership of President Kagame.
I'm greatly humbled to receive this Clinton Global Citizen Award.
He's actually given awards by Bill Clinton for his conduct as the leader of that country, and they regale him as a great military leader. This is the sort of legitimization that we don't want of these kinds of dictators and leaders. That's the kind of legitimization that the Clintons have engaged in. And they've done it in a way that creates commercial opportunities for donors and friends and allies who want to do business in Africa. Business in Africa means you're dealing with dictators who are going to give you access to, say, mineral rights or oil drilling rights, but you're going to have to pay them off. The Clintons partner with foreign entities who want access to Africa, and specifically mining companies or energy companies who need to get concessions for access to oil or natural gas or the rights to mine for gold. Those two make a powerful alliance because these companies will give money to the Clintons, either in the form of speaking fees or in the form of donations to the Clinton Foundation. And the Clintons will then, in effect, do their bidding before the halls of power and corridors of power in Africa. And they will go to foreign governments and encourage them to do business with individuals who are putting money in their pocket. And this leads to some amazing fits of behavior that, in a way, are just reminiscent of 19th century colonialism.
A perfect example of this is Ambassador Joe Wilson. Joe Wilson is a longtime friend of the Clintons. In fact, he endorsed Hillary Clinton in the 2008 presidential election. And it was also thought that he might become a senior official in Hillary Clinton's State Department. But the fact of the matter is Joe Wilson was up to something far more nefarious during Hillary Clinton's tenure as Secretary of State. In 2009, shortly after she became Secretary of State, when Wilson was the vice chairman of a company called Jarch Capital, they took out a 50-year lease on 400,000 hectares in South Sudan. South Sudan was in the middle of a civil war, and this lease was actually signed with warlords who were involved in the civil war. These individuals who were engaged in massive human rights violations, including the massacre of opponent tribes. And basically what Joe Wilson was engaged in was something called investing in sovereignty changes. They were basically cutting deals, lucrative deals, worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars with these warlords. And the expectation was simple. These warlords would take power, then they would give them access to these lands where they could make huge amounts of money exploring for natural gas, exploring for oil, and for mineral rights. Ambassador Joe Wilson isn't the only Clinton friend and foundation donor who was working in war-torn countries. Swedish mining investor Lucas Lundin has pledged $100 million to the Clinton Foundation. He did that in 2007. And his most lucrative mining operations are in the war-torn country of the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is a country that perhaps has the most horrific human rights situation on the face of the earth. By the time Lucas Lundin made his $100 million pledge to the Clinton Foundation, his Congo operation was making, quote, staggering profits, end quote, according to his own financial statements. His overall capitalization was $20 billion. But for those profits to remain staggering, U.S. policy under Hillary Clinton had to remain unchanged. That's a problem. Hillary Clinton, as a senator back in 2006, supported something called the Congo Relief, Security, and Democracy Promotion Act. As the law's name implied, the goal was to bring reform to Congo. That's not something that Lucas Lundin would want. So in 2009, when Hillary became Secretary of State, she reversed course 180 degrees and went from supporting reform in Congo to supporting the status quo, which is exactly what Lucas Lundin would want, who of course had committed $100 million to the Clinton Foundation. But Congo isn't the only scandal-plagued country where Clinton benefactors have made millions.
Africa's most populous nation, Nigeria, is full of promise, but fulfilling that promise is sometimes a struggle. Plagued by corruption and mismanagement, the resource-rich country has a poverty rate of over 50%.
Look at a country like Nigeria, which is really a cesspool of corruption. In fact, people will say it is perhaps the most corrupt country in the world. It's rich in natural resources, it produces a lot of oil, but that money never trickles down to the people. It goes to the oligarchs who run the country, who oftentimes take that money and put it in Swiss bank accounts in a way that, of course, the people of Nigeria can never benefit from. And you see, there's a federal law in the United States which says if foreign governments that receive U.S. assistance aren't transparent in how they spend that money, that they will not be able to get U.S. foreign assistance anymore. It's about transparency. But there's a way around that law. You can get a waiver from that law. How? By getting the U.S. Secretary of State to grant you a waiver.
We intend to remain very supportive on your reform efforts. Thank you for mentioning the work we did together on the elections. We're also very supportive of the anti-corruption reform efforts, more transparency, and the work that you and your team is also championing, because we really believe that the future for Nigeria is limitless.
So in the case of Nigeria, they receive hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. foreign assistance.
They've not made progress in being more transparent, and of course, they've gotten exemptions from Hillary Clinton while she was Secretary of State.
What's so curious about this is what was happening commercially to the Clintons while this was going on. Bill Clinton, for the first time ever, gets paid highly lucrative speeches in Nigeria, which had never happened before. In fact, he gets paid to do 2 speeches for $700,000 apiece by a businessman in Nigeria who just happens to be close with the president of that country. Keep in mind, by the way, that his normal speaking fee is less than $200,000 a speech. So this was an enormous payday for Bill Clinton.
Okay, now we'll begin the panel.
One of the pinnacles of power in that country is a gentleman named Gilbert Chagoury.
Gilbert Chagoury, who has committed $1 billion to the Clinton Global Initiative, is connected to another individual in the Clinton orbit. That would be Mark Rich, the billionaire who was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list that was suddenly and surprisingly pardoned by Bill Clinton in 2001. Mark Rich, you might recall, is somebody who was trading oil with the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran at the same time that the Ayatollah was holding 50 Americans hostage. He also had a long history of busting UN sanctions by trading oil with the apartheid regime in South Africa and a whole host of other nefarious governments. Well, Gilbert Chagoury, the high Clinton donor, was business partners with Mark Rich. Together, they sopped up oil assets in Nigeria and sold them on the oil market for the benefit of a corrupt individual who was leading Nigeria at the time, named General Abacha.
Abacha smuggled, by some estimates, $4 to $8 billion out of the country and put them in European bank accounts. Gilbert Chagoury was indicted and convicted in Europe for helping him to do that. He was charged for aiding and abetting a criminal enterprise and on money laundering charges. And the suffering that ends up being done here is by the people of Nigeria, who see their leadership getting a pass from the United States. The elites in those countries are getting rich, the Clintons are getting rich, and the money somehow never trickles down to the people of Nigeria.
Sadly, this theme of resources not trickling down to those most in need is a common one when it comes to the Clintons.